Go ahead.
It seems next to impossible that the indigenous population of Manitoba didn't have the vote until 1960. How is that possible?
Well, actually, we had it here in the province of Manitoba in 1954. Federally, of course, we didn't become eligible to vote until 1960. And of course, in the other provinces of Canada, the dates varied, and we eventually got the vote, and basically Indian people, as were called back then, First Nations, or Indigenous peoples, as we're referred to now, were basically a non-entity in Canadian politics. And finally, in 1954, we got the right to vote. And one of the first people that ever ran for elected office was actually a gentleman by the name of Alfred Cook from a community of Bloodvein. And I had the opportunity of meeting Mr. Cook in the early 1980s. As a young man, I wanted to know, what his experience was. And he ran with, I guess, Ed Schreier in the 1960s. And when the NDP first formed the government here in 1969 in the province of Manitoba. And I've met other people that gave it a run for Manitoba politics. I have come across people that have served federally, who ran federally, some unsuccessfully, some were successful. The late Len Marchand from British Columbia, who is a Liberal cabinet minister under the late Prime Minister Trudeau, was a gentleman I held in high regard, and viewed him as a model, role model, I would say, because he was able to do some things, and also probably one of the first First Nations people to serve in the federal cabinet. So based on that, we do have a history, although it's not a pronounced history. It is nevertheless a history of Indigenous peoples having run in federal and provincial politics. And of course, in British Columbia, we have Frank Calder from the Nisga'a Nation, who was involved on a very high-profile court case for many years, which later became known as the Calder case. Frank Calder was an MLA for a constituency called Athlone in the province of British Columbia. Served there for many years under the CCF, NDP, and later became a member of the Social Credit Party, and then eventually left politics. So, and here in the province of Manitoba, we've had, before my time, Jean Allard, who represented the constituency of Rupert's Land, which later became Kiiwetinoong, and on the east side of Manitoba. And then Harvey Bostrom in 1973, a Métis person from Manigataugan, served until 1981. Elijah Harper, and then took over in 1981. And Elijah turned out to be one of our heroes in Canada among the Aboriginal community. And he left his mark, certainly, in Canadian politics, and certainly served as I believe, a role model and a springboard for others to become engaged in the mainstream political system. So I think that based on those few people, I think that we've had an opportunity. It is my hope that I'll live to see a leader of a major political party that's of Indigenous ancestry and a woman. I would like to see that in my time, and before I have to journey on to the next world, that is one of the desires that I have.
Now, as you say, you had a chance to meet and talk to a lot of these people. What did they tell you about the political life? What did they thought you should know about it?
Well, I think that, first of all, nobody really took me seriously that I would ever become elected, because I wasn't one of those real serious people, as a young man. I was viewed more on the outside as being a little more radical in my views, the Red Power type Indian person, I will say, back in those days. But I didn't really have a strong interest to become engaged in the mainstream political system. I was more inclined towards journalism and how we could become more better heard, I suppose. I look back to Brunelda Wheeler, who was the host of Our Native Land, and I viewed her as one of my role models, because she was tremendously gifted in communicating some of the um, First Nations activities that were going on across Canada through the reporters that she had throughout Canada, and they weren't necessarily Indigenous peoples, but certainly the ones that fed the show information. And it was a weekly show, a weekly 1 hour show, I think, brought Canada together, and I think that's sometimes overlooked. And then, of course, I was involved with the CBC Northern Service, where Inuktitut and Cree, Dene, and those other languages were prominent in the Northern Service of the CBC. So I was a part of that movement. So I thought communications was an important tool, and television came to be. And then, of course, in the modern world, we have social media, which has really taken off, and has really, I would say, the mainstream media to the side, because I think that for the most part we get our information now from social media as opposed to the mainstream media system. So we have a changing and evolving world.
So, how did you actually see your future as a young guy perceived to be a radical?
Well, I thought that some political figures, and I don't really want to mention their names, who were already in the business, asked me. They said, "Erik, you're well known up north. Your views are not necessarily embraced by everybody, but you're not afraid to speak, and you're not really a shy person." So when Elijah retired, and that was after Meech Lake, and after making his mark, and decided to leave in 1992, I decided to seek the nomination for the 1993 by-election that came to be. And of course, in 1993, Gordon McIntosh, who's still around, Norma McCormick for the Liberals, and Harry Schellenberg from Rossmere, and Gary Kowalski from the northwest part of Winnipeg. The five of us were elected in that by-election in 1993. Three of us were New Democrats, and two of us were Liberals. So I think that from that point forward, I was successful in being re-elected 5 times over. So, up until 2016, I was defeated in the general election by a young woman by the name of Judy Clausen, who's from St. Teresa Point. But I attribute that loss not so much to one's popularity, but maybe because people have seen enough of you or don't see enough of you. There's many factors, in my view, from my perspective. And it happened to Elijah. He ran federally, lasted 1 term, and then lost the seat back to the NDP, just the nature of the business. So I think that in a lot of ways, after serving 23 years in our provincial legislature here in Manitoba, and 16 of those years as a cabinet minister in various portfolios, including sport, Aboriginal Northern Affairs, culture, heritage, tourism, and being the deputy premier of our province. I think it gave me a broader perspective and a greater understanding about the involvement of Indigenous peoples in mainstream politics. I'm still not convinced that is where we belong, but to a large degree I think that we have to have some influence, because the provincial government by and large does play a significant role in the everyday lives of Indigenous peoples. So I think that I would encourage folks that may be interested to get involved, whether at the federal level or at the provincial, even municipal level. I think more the better, the more voices that are heard advocating and advancing Indigenous issues. I think those are very critical and very important to be heard.
Now you have a unique qualification and a unique background experience in that you were part of the residential school system. So that means that you bring something really important. I mean, something that needs to be present. How did your experience in the residential school prepare you for a public life?
I think to a large degree it probably prepared me with having a bit of an edge, because when you're in residential school you have to be a survivor to survive the beatings and some of the negative things that did occur to us as children, at the hands of priests and nuns. So you're always you always had to have your back not turned too much, and you had to be on your feet. You had to think. You had to, and also be prepared for the consequences. If you did something wrong, if you happened to speak your language, you had to be prepared for the consequences. So that those survival skills kicked in. So having been abused and in a way that changed, I think, my whole future, I think, at that young age, because I wasn't quite 5 years old when I entered the residential school, and I was just going on 5 years old when I entered the school. But I was one of the fortunate ones at the same time, because I got to leave there before I was 9 when my dad took me. And like everybody else, I came from a family of dysfunction. My mother died when I was 11 years old in Winnipeg, suspiciously. And but she had 2 children, and I got to stay with my father. My younger sister, who's just a couple years younger than me, was raised by a good family in Norway House. And then she married a man here in Winnipeg, a Métis man, and she had 2 children. So the 4 of us really never got connected until 1980s, early 1980s. So the 2 younger ones didn't even know that they had an older sibling, or older siblings rather. My younger sister, who was just a little younger than I, we always knew of each other. Because we were told in our, the families that we were brought up in. So we kind of knew about one another. So I think that with that background, it gave me a bit of an edge. I certainly wasn't scared of authority. And I thought the beatings only hurt for so long. And I took the best punches that the priests and the brothers and the nuns could throw. So I thought, I could survive, so I wasn't afraid of that kind of authority. I never was, and And I learned how certain survival skills, I suppose, and I was able to be able to use those skills, into my adulthood as a younger man, and then leaving home early, doing different things, even venturing into journalism, doing different things, advocacy work, doing some work that was viewed as being radical and not normal, and then getting into the political world, and so I had that tremendous opportunity and that unique experience from my upbringing.
What was so allegedly radical about you?
Well, I suppose like everybody else, you have your ideals, you want to change the world. You have things that you want to do. You have things that you dream of things you want to do when you're a young person. Some succeed, some don't, and I had suppose my own views about how we improve the lives, not necessarily taking over, but some of those dreams I still hold, including having the first prime minister or the first premier being of indigenous ancestry in Canada. I hold those dreams out. I would like to see more of our young people get engaged. I'd like to see the empowerment of young people become more pronounced in all ways, really. I hate to see the statistical numbers of the number of young people in jail, for example. I don't like seeing that. I hate visiting our people in jail when they're doing jail time for whatever reason. I met some young men that are doing time in there for a very long time, some that may never see freedom again. But I've had that opportunity as well. So I think that we have to take it upon ourselves, where we are, after all, viewed, no matter what we say, we're viewed as being the elders now of our communities and of our ceremonies and all these kind of things. So we have to always promote, I think, the notion that positive thinking and all these positive things have to be first and foremost in everything we do. And I think that knowing who you are as an Indigenous person, whether you're of Ojibwe, Dakota, Cree background, and never forgetting who you are, is what these old-timers passed on to me. They said, hey, this is not a game for your own gain, is what I was told. And I remember the late Dave Kershane, who was one of the first, in fact, the first Grand Chief of Manitoba, tell me when I went to visit him at his home, say, Eric, this business, politics, is not about Eric Robinson. This business is about the people, the ones that are not able to speak for themselves, the ones that are not able to attain those things, the basic needs that Canadians take for granted. Those are the things that you're striving for. That's what it takes to be a political leader. With those kind of words, encouraging me, how can you go wrong? It helps you stand strong, I think, to a large degree, and it helps you be more determined, puts that fire in your belly, as they say. And it also gives you, I think, more, put you in a position of wanting to be a better fighter for your people. Not a dirty fighter, a good fighter.
But I'm puzzled by something, and I think probably a lot of people may have been, and that is, in spite of all these efforts to separate you from the identity that you inherited in terms of family and community, how did you find your way to your Aboriginal identity in spite of all those efforts to keep you away from it?
I think that it was always there, so I never did lose that part of it. I never lost my language. I was one of the fortunate ones. I've always been able to hang on to my language, the ceremonial part. It was instilled in me by my dad, you know, to hang on to those things. And he almost, growing up, you know, as a little boy, and then after I got out of the residential school, he almost whispered them to me. You know, he didn't say it loudly. He just said, you know, well, you know, this is what you got to do. This is what has to happen. This is what you have to pray for when you become a father. And he told me about those things. So with that, you know, but of course you know, I didn't listen in a lot of cases either, because you know, I was drinking by the time I was 12 years old. I was sleeping under bridges in Seattle, Washington, in my late teens. Was getting into trouble. I was drinking, fighting, and you name it. And then at the age of 22, I became sober and drug-free. And I'm one of the lucky ones in a lot of ways, you know, having, you know, ventured into that lifestyle. I was lucky to get out of it at an early age. So I've been sober for most of my life. I think that I probably lost about 8-9 years of my life because of the negative things, alcohol and drugs and those kind of things. And but I was one of the lucky ones, so I always look at it that way. But still, you know, that was drowning another pain from a previous experience when I should have been a kid, a child, enjoying himself, only to be, only that nobody knew that I was being tortured in the residential school that I was in, which I never talked about. Obviously nobody talked about it. And then I went and drowned that out, that hurt and that pain, for a long period of time. And then I turned that into another more positive form in advocating and advancing the issues of Indigenous peoples.
So there's so many issues. Which ones did you embrace first and foremost?
Well, I think that the ones that couldn't speak for themselves is some that I addressed right away. For example, missing and murdered women. You know, I've been at this since the 1990s, simply because they were not getting the attention. And I thought, where are the men leaders? Where are the male leaders? They're a part of this too. We're supposed to be the protectors. We're supposed to be this and that. So with the death of Helen Betty Osborne, and when finally somebody was convicted of her death in 1971 on November 13th of that year, I became involved with her family that she left behind, her late mom. She became a good friend, and I knew Betty Osborne when we were kids. I used to see her. I knew who she was. But of course, you know, I was not an intimate friend of hers. But as kids, we knew who we were. You know, I mean, we used to go to Rossville at Norrie House at treaty time. So we used to see all these kids, and of course, there's not as many kids as there is nowadays. You know, I mean, back then you kind of had an idea who was who. Population wasn't as great. So we were able to bring together the killer that was eventually convicted of the crime of Betty Osborne's murder in 1971 and members of her family. And they were told by the person that was involved in her killing what happened. I wasn't privy to that. I was not present with whatever was discussed with family members, and Dwayne Archie Johnston. So I don't know what was discussed. Also, what stands out too is bringing victims of a pedophile who was a Boy Scout leader, who was an Anglican priest, an Ontario provincial police officer, and a bush pilot by the name of Ralph Rowe, and some of his victims and himself, who was serving time in British Columbia. I was able to facilitate these things as an opposition MLA when we were in the opposition between 1993 and 1999. So anybody that says you can't do anything as an MLA and be able to facilitate anything is totally wrong, because I was able to do it. If I can do it, anybody can do it. So we were able to bring those parties together and sit down and have a healing process. Ralph Rowe was involved and convicted of many things, and he wound up doing, I think, serving an 8-year sentence for the boys that he tormented, and many suicides resulted from that in northern Ontario and in some communities in northern Manitoba. And that's something that's rarely talked about, but he was one of the most notorious people, and to me, one of the most narcissistic people that I've ever met, because I met him one-on-one prior to the meeting with his victims. And because we had to lay down the ground rules, I had to say, look, Mr. Rowe, you can't be, taking this as an easy way out. This is very important. This is a traditional healing circle we're going to have. We're going to be talking about hurtful things. These guys will have to, you're going to have to take it, whatever they got to say to you. So we did that, and of course that work carried on, with other things, and I started working with other residential school survivors. Little did they know that I went through similar things. The guys that are doing time in a penitentiary and working with them, and that work still carries on to this day, and it'll carry on as long as I'm able, as long as I have the strength, because I think it's very important. We need an advocate for our people, and I'll contribute in my own way, in my own small way, because, as you know, in Manitoba we have 2 sets of boys that were switched at birth. Well, they're men now, 42 years old actually, and that happened at the Norrie House Indian Hospital back in 1975.
And tell us exactly what happened.
Well, what happened in early 1975, early February, was the wrong child went home with the wrong parents, in the case of 2 people. In June, as a matter of fact, June 20th of 1975, 2 other children went home with the wrong parents. The 2 boys grew up in Garden Hill. The 2 boys grew up in Norrie House. They looked like each other's families. And comments were made throughout their lifetime. Eventually, a couple of years ago, we went through the DNA testing to settle these questions that they had in their minds. And sure enough, what they suspected came to be that, in fact, Mr. Monias really belonged to the Barkman family, and Mr. Barkman was actually a Monias. So, since that time, they've had challenges in how to deal with this and how to approach it. So we need people out there advocating on behalf of our folks, and I get to be a pain in the neck sometimes for governments, but those are the things. But while in government, we had the opportunity of doing many things. We started. We want to protect the east side of our province from development, because we need the lungs of Mother Earth to be able to to be able to sustain us. And many of our elders and our young people encourage that kind of protection of Mother Earth. So we did that work, and of course, to this day, we're still hoping that this part of Manitoba will be protected under the UNESCO program, and hopefully it'll be an area that'll remain untouched. And then, of course, building the East Side Road, which connects these communities, is something that we started under my watch as a minister, and responsible for the East Side Road Authority, and together with capable people like Ernie Gilroy, we worked. It wasn't perfect, you know. People will be critical of the work, and they're probably right to a certain degree, but at the very least, we began the work, and the new government more or less kind of halted that. Didn't halt it entirely, but slowed it down. But I think with climate change, people are realizing that we need an all-weather road system, whether we like it or not, in the eastern part of Manitoba, because the winter road system has failed on many occasions, only to cause pain and suffering further for our people. And I've always been a champion of Churchill. Churchill is a place that I spent a lot of time in my youth, and I view it as my second home community. It's a great town, and what's happened there recently with the with Omnitrax, the U.S.-based company, and how Churchill has really become disconnected with Manitoba, and why Canada will not take a playing role in that, in trying to ensure that the people of Churchill feel that they're a part of Canada, is beyond me. And the government of Manitoba has to take a role as well too. And certainly people that live along the Bay Line have been affected. We can't just think of Churchill, but there's people that rely on that rail line to get goods and services from the outside world. So that's an ongoing issue, and I'll continue my best to try and advocate from the outside on their behalf. So, and I think that there's a lot of things you can do. There's a lot of things. I don't want to blow my own horn here. We've been able to ensure, I think, to a large degree, the ongoing pride of Indigenous peoples through their culture, that they no longer have to hide it, that they don't have to pretend that they're not Indigenous people, you know, as the case was once so common. And we created the Manitowoc Festival for All Nations, which is really something that I just came to me, and then I called upon other people, artists and musicians, people like that, and solicited their thoughts, and together we built this together.
Where did that idea come from?
I don't know. It just came to me. And but the idea in its entirety is not mine. I can't take credit for that, because there are people like Errol Ranville, Lisa Meaches, other people like that were involved in that had their own thoughts, their own ideas, how we promote ourselves as Indigenous peoples through music, through the traditional activities, the trade fair, all these different kind of things, you know, the artistic side of things, if you will, and the promotion and to ensure the ongoing life of our way of life as Indigenous peoples is through that Manitowoc Festival. And this year it just celebrated its 10th anniversary. So I'm very proud that I was a very small part of that.
Tell me about your role in dealing with the 60s scoop. What was that, and how were you involved?
I was not a big player in that, but I mean, I did help out with some people that were adopted out. I was trying to be helpful as an elected Indian leader prior to the mainstream political stuff, in bringing back some people that were taken away from Canada, taken away from their province, taken away from their community, placed in foreign environments, raised as non-native people, and come home, get reintroduced. And that's where the problems began, really, for a lot of them, because they were totally foreign, totally didn't know anything about themselves as Cree Indian people, as Ojibways, as Dakotas, because that was foreign to them. I mean, as a residential school survivor, it was tough enough for me and for us that went there, but at least we had each other. But can you imagine being a little brown kid from a reserve in northern Manitoba, being raised in the southern United States, let's say in Louisiana or Mississippi or one of those states, and even worse, being an Indian kid from one of the northern communities and being raised in Holland or Germany or somewhere like that, and there's still some out there that we haven't even brought back. So that needs redress. And you know, in a lot of ways, they had it worse than those of us that went to residential school, because at the very least we had each other. In their case, they had nobody to look to. They had nobody they could relate to, because everyone around them didn't look like them, and they didn't look like anybody else. So you know, that to me is very hurtful still to this day. The government of Canada has made overtures that it wants to address the issues. Certainly something before I left office and since then that I pointed out to the Federal Indian Affairs Minister, Bennett. I said, Minister Bennett, this has got to be addressed. This is totally something that is unacceptable. And I also said to her, publicly, privately, we have to reset this missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls file, because we want to do it right, because there's been so many people that have gone missing. And it's not even girls and women only nowadays. It's also men and boys that have gone missing. And still to this day, we're having to deal with that. So the federal government, and I give credit to the current government, but I think that they have to take a step back. They have to think about what they're doing and get it right. Because certainly what we don't want in a couple of years when they're done their work is another report that will serve no purpose, as we have done here with the killing of J.J. Harper and Helen Betty Osborne, when the then government, the NDP government here in Manitoba, got the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry underway.
Can we talk a little bit about your role in the AJI?
I worked for Commissioners Hamilton and Sinclair. I was at the advance worker. I worked in the prisons and got the guys ready, you know, for the hearings. I traveled to the communities and told them what this commission was about, and prepared them. And before the commissioners came to their communities, we were all set up, and presenters talked about their dealings with the justice system, period. Whether it was in child welfare, whether it was being arrested, whether it was being treated, differently by police services, whether it be city or otherwise. So we heard a wide array of problems with respect to Aboriginal people and their dealings with the justice system. So I think that that served as a good starting point in Canada. And then, of course, beyond that, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples took off. And that was something that was also not taken seriously. And when we took office in 1999, Gord McIntosh and I, in his new office as the Attorney General, found that the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry still wrapped in a cellophane paper. It was never opened by the previous government. So that was one of our first tasks. Was we went to work and started addressing on those areas that focused or related to the province of Manitoba. The province of Manitoba had something like 93 recommendations of the 294 recommendations made by the AGI that directly related to the province of Manitoba. The remainder were the City of Police, the City of Winnipeg Police, and also the federal government. So we've made slow progress there too. So I think that inquiries are viewed upon as with a little skepticism, in my view, and because some of us have lived through them, only to see that we've had the inquiries, we've researched the hell out of them, but no tangible results have come about. So we've become skeptical about some of these things. So, and that's the way we feel about the missing and murdered Indigenous women's file.
Were you able to make any impact on racism in Manitoba as a very high-profile, influential Aboriginal person?
I'd like to think so, but of course, at every opportunity, there were the people that said Eric Robinson's a racist, because there was the story that's widely known here. If people only knew the inside of that story, where the tables turned and they accused me of being the racist. But people don't take the time and the trouble to do the research on how that really came about. And really what I was saying, they were trying to put on a fundraiser for a women's shelter in South Winnipeg, actually. What used to be the Osborne House, and how they were going to raise money was through a burlesque show. And I thought, that doesn't make sense to me. These are vulnerable women already, and I said so in an email to one of the staffers. And I think, and I did go through the motions of saying I apologize, but of course I wasn't directing it at her. The executive director at the time, the CEO of the center, it wasn't directed at her, so she rejected the apology. I don't care, because it wasn't directed at her, but the general statement itself, I think, was taken wrong and misunderstood. On the other hand, many people understood what I was saying exactly. And what I was talking about is, sometimes, people think what is best for Eric? We'll send him to a residential school. We'll cut his hair off. We'll de-Indianize him, and make a good little brown white guy out of him. That's basically the nature of that. So in racism, I wish I could say that racism has disappeared in Manitoba. I wish I could say that I was influential. Perhaps I was in a few cases. Perhaps I was to a small degree. But regrettably, I think racism is here. It will continue being here. It'll be here after we're dead. And I think that the challenge is now up to the leaders coming up on how they want to deal with it, on how they're going to deal with it. But I think that, having said all this, I don't want to sound all doom and gloom. I think that there's been progress made.
Where?
And one of the areas that I talked about was in the promotion of Manitowoc, a celebration, a festival for all nations, where people have the opportunity, if they want, to learn about Indigenous peoples. We're in this together. We're all holding hands, brown, white, you name it. People from all countries have come here to what was originally the homeland of the Ojibwe people, the Assiniboines, the Crees, the Dakotas, and the birthplace of the Métis Nation. People are here from all over the world, and they have to learn that. So I was very proud of my daughter because she advocated and advanced that issue, that this be part of the curriculum in university, but moreover, also at the lower level. So I give credit to my daughter, who was going to university at the time, and the chancellor, I think, or the president of the university at the time was Lloyd Axworthy. So I was very proud that eventually, a few years later, it was adopted, and that an Indigenous curriculum became part of what is taught there.
Is it possible to say which of the battles that you fought has meant the most to you?
Well, there's been a few good fights, I'll say that. It's like an old fighter. I would have to say that there's been a few worth getting bloodied over. I thought that, allowing people to feel a sense of pride, the celebration of who we are. The Manitowoc Festival was a tremendous breakthrough, and I think that that was among the many things that we were able to do. I mean, we were busy all the time. Selinger and I, when he was premier, and Gary Dewar before that, being able to. I think that one that stands out as well is that we're able to get dialysis treatment facilities on a couple of reserves, something that was never done anywhere in Canada. And that made me feel good because we made a breakthrough. We broke down some barriers, and because some argued that provinces have no business on reserves. Well, at election time, we're the first ones to say that Indians are Manitobans too. So let's prove that to be true. And that's when we moved to have the dialysis treatment facilities, because diabetes and kidney type problems are so prominent in the Aboriginal community that it had to be addressed. So we were able to do that in a couple of reserves, which prevented, in the cases of some anyway, not all, I wish I could say all, having to move to a foreign environment like Winnipeg, being disconnected from their families, the traditional way of eating, whether it's fish, wild meat, or anything of that nature, and then being thrown here, and sometimes they just died of loneliness. So, and doing things like that was really meaningful. Having partnerships on hydro development and getting the go-ahead by First Nations was also something I felt proud of. And I said that publicly up north. I said, look, hydro development will not occur because our way of life was destroyed. They build hydro dams. They were done wrong. They destroyed a lot of great habitat. It destroyed fishing grounds. It's still not fully restored to its original state. Never will be. And we have to protect what we can. So if we're going to be engaged in hydro development, we better be sure that it's done in a respectful way, and it's done with keeping in mind that we have to protect the integrity of Mother Earth. So that's a position that I took, and I think that by and large, it's happening to this day. It's long gone are the days where you just send in a crew and dig up the land and build a dam. That doesn't happen anymore. So there are those things that I'm very proud of, that we made sure that the folks that live there, that were born there and make a livelihood from there, are a part of that. So I'm very proud of a few things that we have done, in spite of the, in spite of the challenges.
I don't want to let you go before just having a little talk about the new generation. I mean, young Aboriginal people have so many reasons to be alienated from Canada. As you know, there's people who are saying 150 years of what, right? I'm wondering how you see the younger generation and what evidence in particular you see that they can change things, that they will be engaged.
Don't give up the good fight. I'm one of those too that questions, what the heck have we got to celebrate? 150 years of assimilation attempts on a people? We don't have much to celebrate. So I'm one of those people. But I want to see our young people be more assertive. I would like them to be a little more. I don't want to see them killed, fighting for Mother Earth, or, but doing things in a proper way, and through being the voices in Parliament, the voices in legislatures, in city councils across this country, or even in the courts. They our young people. That's what I have hope for in a time to come, and communication too. I am not talking about the whole social media, but my daughter's a journalist. I tell her, tell the story, tell our people's story, tell it the way you were told by those people you speak with, and that's the only advice I've ever given her. Beyond that, she's got her own mind, she's got her own thinking, and I don't interfere in what she does. But I think that being a storyteller, what a journalist is supposed to be, and even being a camera person, you have to get the right shots, if you will, and there's different things that are occurring. We're an evolving world. You know that. I know that. We have to, I believe, adapt to a lot of things. A lot of things are changing. We have to catch up in a lot of cases. Even the use of cell phones, smartphones, all these kind of things, texting and you name it. These things weren't around some years ago. It was all the different things that are coming to be that are a lot different. So I think that I hold out a lot of hope that there's positive things that are happening for Indigenous peoples.
Just a question, and I was distracted because
There's a cop car there.
What? What?
Isn't that a cop car?
Oh no, it's the pool guy.
I
I thought.
I was ready to jump out the window. All habits die.
Oh, that was.
It takes a long time.
Okay. Yeah, I know my last question. You must be feeling kind of worn out by now. Oh, what next?
No, I'm okay.
Are we still on? Yeah. um, what about reconciliation? Is it possible?
I think reconciliation is possible, but not on the terms of the federal government either, and not on the terms of provincial governments, but it has to be mutually agreed upon. And how do you achieve that? You have to have dialogue. You have to be able to have a discussion, a frank discussion, and it can't be one way. And that's how I've seen a lot of things happening. Actually, as much as I am not a conservative, I have never been, far from it. I was very proud of the 2008 apology by Stephen Harper towards residential school survivors. I thought it was meaningful. Other people said it meant nothing. To me, it was an acknowledgement for the first time. And of all people, by a conservative prime minister. So I thought from that point on, I think that we've been able to move on to other things. And there's still a lot of reconciliation work to be done, without a doubt. And I think that the current prime minister has that opportunity. He's young and he's open-minded, you know, but while we have him in his first term, he's got to prove himself. Because after your first term, hey, you may forget what your agenda was, you know, which is what happens. And then after that, it's political survival. And power seems to be the thing of mainstream political parties. I hate to say that, but I've witnessed it. After you win the election, the next election campaign begins pretty much the day after. So, you know, people start counting their terms after they win their first election. That can't be anymore. And I think that we got to consider having Indigenous voices heard more. How do we do that? Do we want to do that with the mainstream political parties, or do we want to have our own? So that's a discussion that's got to be had yet.
What do you think?
I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, you're right, I suppose it's it.
Yeah. If you want to go be a liberal, go be a liberal. If you want to go be a conservative, go ahead. If you want to be a New Democrat, fine. But don't forget who you are first and foremost. You are an Indigenous person. Your forefathers are committed to the land, the integrity of Mother Earth. That's first and foremost. Secondly, you can toe the party line all you like, but first and foremost, you can't forget who you are. That's the only advice I have.
Great.